Welcome to this lecture series on presidents, plutocrats, paupers, and populists. We're going to begin with part one, the Grant administration. When historians take a look at this time period after the Civil War, this time of the Second Industrial Revolution, we tend to call it the Gilded Age, right? Now that term comes from Mark Twain. Mark Twain in 1873 wrote a book with Charles Dudley Warner called The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. Right? Now, this book is satire. It talks about political greed and corruption in the post-Civil War America, and the gilding itself, that kind of lends to it. What he's saying here, his message here is that the post-Civil War America is a piece of cheap metal gilded with a thin veneer of gold to make it look valuable, right? Politics during this time was dominated by what was called laissez-faire, or hands-off government. Right? And the idea was simply this: if we are believers in freedom and liberty in our personal lives, why not let that happen in business as well, especially during this time of a second industrial revolution and this economic boom that'll cause. And then there was also the spoil system politically. The spoil system had been established by Andrew Jackson in 1828 when he removed as many of John Quincy Adams's men as he could when he became president and replaced them with people who were, well, not necessarily qualified, but who had helped him obtain power. And you can really see these ideas of laissez-faire and the spoil system at work when we take a look at the two terms of Ulysses S. Grant. When Ulysses S. Grant won the 1868 election, a lot of people breathed a sigh of relief to just finally know that they're going to be rid of Andrew Johnson. Remember, Andrew Johnson spent his entire time as presidency very much embattled and even coming one vote away from being removed from office, right? So Grant was a welcome change. And Grant was a very famous individual. He was the commander-in-chief of the Union Army during the Civil War, and he was a fantastic general. This doesn't always translate into necessarily making good decisions, though, as a president. He did have one of these attributes that is a hallmark of a good leader. He was really good at delegating authority. Good leaders don't micromanage things. They delegate. And so he would delegate, like he did when he was a general, he would delegate to his subordinates, and they were responsible for getting things done, right? You know, a general tells a subordinate officer, take that hill. He doesn't necessarily care exactly how you take that hill as long as it gets done, and it gets done with the minimum amount of losses. That should work as president as well, provided that the people you have appointed under you are competent. But because of the spoil system, many of the people underneath him were not just incompetent, they were outright corrupt. And so it made Ulysses S. Grant's presidency one of the most scandal-ridden presidencies in American history. How scandal-ridden was the Grant presidency? Well, let me put it this way. We'll talk about 4 scandals and then we'll get bored and we'll move on to something else, right? Starting with his first year as president, 1869, Black Friday. 2 financiers, Jay Gould and James Big Jim Fisk, are going to attempt to corner the gold market. Their plan was simple. All plans should be simple, right? Grant was trying to reduce the supply of paper money by exchanging it for gold, right? Basically making the federal government more reliant on specie, on gold, okay? Currency at this time in America was backed by gold. We're on a thing called the gold standard, okay? So what did these guys do? They needed to convince President Grant to abandon this policy. To do this, they recruited a man named Abel Rathbone Corbin, another financier, and the husband of Grant's sister. And his job is going to be to help influence, because he has this inside access, to help convince Grant. All right. Now, Corbin is going to convince Ulysses S. Grant to appoint General Daniel Butterfield, a friend of Grant, to be the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, so that they have an inside man in the Treasury Department, so they know when the government plans to sell gold on the open market. This is great insider information, because what they would do is they would buy up gold and drive the price up. But right before they knew the government was about to sell off a bunch of gold on the open market, they would sell off their assets. Then you would have the release of gold, the price of gold would plummet, and then they would start buying up again. See what I mean? They can corner the market that way. Now, Unfortunately for these men, Grant found out about this scandal. He didn't know about it, but what had happened was that Abel Rathbone Corbin told his wife, Grant's sister, about the plan. Grant's sister happened to be good friends with Grant's wife. The two communicated by letters, and she told Grant's wife about this great money-making deal that her husband was involved in, not realizing that it was really just insider trading, even though that's not really an illegal thing yet, right? And the letter was left on a nightstand. Grant comes into the bedside, finds the letter, sees it's from his sister to his wife, she's kind of curious, reads it, finds out about the scandal. He's infuriated, right? He immediately orders the sale of $4 million of government gold onto the market. And on September 24th, 1869, the market on gold bottomed out, causing both Big Jim Fisk and Jay Gould to lose a lot of money. Not enough to make them paupers, but they certainly did take quite a big hit. There's scandal number one. 1872, Credit Mobilier. This has to do with the Transcontinental Railroad, right? What happened is that a guy by the name of Thomas Durant, who was the head of the Union Pacific Road, the railroad that was going from Omaha westward, had set up a front company called Credit Mobilier, right? And what he was doing with this shell company, if you will, is he was siphoning off profits from the Transcontinental Railroad, and he would use this fake company to subcontract railroad contracts and to get insider information on where the government planned to run the railroad. This allowed him, Thomas Durant, to buy the land up first and then sell it back to the government at a big markup. And in order to get this information, he would give away stocks in the front company, Credit Mobilier, right? A lot of people were involved in this, including the sitting vice president in the United States, Schuyler Colfax. Matter of fact, Schuyler Colfax will not be the vice presidential candidate for Grant's reelection run because of this scandal. Okay, so again, here's another scandal that touched the White House. Grant probably didn't know about it, but it even went so far as to unseat the sitting vice president of the United States. 1874, in Grant's second term, you have the Sanborn incident. The Secretary of Treasury, a man named William A. Richardson, had been recently appointed to the office of Secretary of the Treasury because the previous Secretary of Treasury had gotten fired for corruption, had hired a man named John B. Sanborn to collect back taxes. Now, here was a standard thing that happened. You would hire these contractors, you would fill out this contract, which allowed them to go out and get taxes that were unpaid. And typically what would happen is the contract would allow the person collecting the back taxes to keep 10% of any taxes he collected. But Sanborn's contract was a little bit different. He had managed to get his contract modified, which allowed him to keep 50% of the back taxes paid, half, right? Now, when the scandal broke, Secretary of Treasury Richardson said, well, I thought these contracts were all per forma. I didn't read them, I just signed them. What a great defense, right? He said, look, I'm not corrupt, I'm just incompetent. Now, as a result of this, Sanborn had been able to collect $427,000 in back taxes. That's in the millions of dollars today, and he had pocketed over $200,000 of it, right? In January of 1874, the fraud was discovered, and Richardson was forced to resign. There goes another Secretary of the Treasury. Matter of fact, under pressure to replace the Secretary of Treasury with an honest man this time, Grant appointed a man named Benjamin Bristow, an appointment that would later lead to the discovery of the next scandal, 1875, and the whiskey ring. A longtime friend and political backer of Grant by the name of General John McDonald was the supervisor of the U.S. Treasury Department's Bureau of Internal Revenue, the predecessor to the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, right? McDonald was also deeply involved in the Republican Party. In the early 1870s, he embarked on a plan to raise funds for political candidates running as Republicans by siphoning off tax expenditures on the whiskey distillers in the areas that he controlled. And he had influence over the whiskey distillers all the way up the Mississippi River and into Wisconsin. Okay, so by 1873, he was pulling in $1.5 million per year in what should have been tax money into the Republican coffers. How was he doing it? He would tell the whiskey distillers, I will collect taxes on this percentage of your inventory. I will forget that this percentage of your inventory exists, and you in turn pay me a bribe that he then turns around and puts into the Republican coffers for candidates. Okay, Bristol discovers this scheme, right, and he makes it his personal duty to try and completely rout out this corruption. So he is going to begin rounding up and indicting people. And in total, you're going to have over 300 people arrested and indicted, including a man named Orville Babcock, who was a friend and the personal secretary to General Grant himself. So now President Grant is possibly implicated. But again, it's pretty clear historically that Grant probably didn't know. He expected the subordinates to do their job, and he just really, he was trustworthy to a fault. Okay. Grant would even go so far as to testify on Babcock's behalf during his trial, and Babcock would be one of the few that got acquitted. In total, you're going to have 238 people stand trial, 110 will be convicted, $3 million of stolen tax money will be recovered, right? Babcock would eventually fall into trouble later. Again, in this particular incident, even though Grant did testify on his behalf, it ruined the relationship, and he would have to resign as Grant's personal secretary. So there's 4 scandals right there. And all I can say from this point is just et cetera, right, to quote the King and I. Because that's just 4 of many scandals, right? For example, 1872, New York Custom House ring. There was corruption in the New York Customs House, including involving a man we'll talk about later, Chester A. Arthur. 1872, the Star Route postal ring, a postal contractor scam on the coveted long-distance routes. 1872, the salary grab, a salary bonus scam that congressmen were basically voting themselves bonuses. 1875, the Department of Interior Secretary Delano was taking bribes and got caught. 1875, the Pratt and Boyd bribery. Pratt and Boyd Company bribed the U.S. Attorney General not to prosecute them for fraud. 1876, the Belknap bribery. The Secretary of War was extorting money in exchange for trading contracts in the far western forts. 1876, the Robeson bribery. The Secretary of Navy, because why not, right? He was taking bribes too for naval contracts. 1876, the safe burglary conspiracy. Orville Babcock is indicted for framing a private citizen for a crime that he committed. So like I said, there's a lot of corruption in this administration of Ulysses S. Grant.